There are dangers that announce themselves with noise and chaos. And then there are dangers that wait, that breathe quietly in the background, shaping outcomes long before anyone realizes they have been set in motion. And Sheila has always belonged to the second kind. Long after everyone convinced themselves that she had disappeared, that the storm had passed, she remained, watching, listening, learning the rhythms of the lives she intended to disrupt again. Her absence was never truly absence, only distance, a calculated withdrawal that allowed her to study the fragile emotional landscape around Deacon and Taylor, to understand not just what they were doing, but what they feared, what they hid, what they refused to confront even within themselves. While others moved forward, believing the past had loosened its grip, Sheila stood in the shadows, assembling something far more dangerous than a direct attack, something patient, intricate, and devastating in its precision. What made Sheila truly terrifying was not her willingness to act, but her understanding of when not to act. She had learned, through experience and obsession, that the most effective destruction often comes not from force, but from manipulation, from placing just enough pressure on the right fractures so that people collapse under the weight of their own emotions. And in Deacon and Taylor, she saw exactly that kind of fracture, a connection that appeared stable on the surface, but was built on unspoken compromises and buried truths. When she began to suspect that something was wrong, that the bond between them was not as sincere as it seemed, she did not rush to expose it. Instead, she allowed the suspicion to grow, feeding it with fragments of observation, with carefully interpreted moments that slowly shaped her understanding into something sharper, something more dangerous. By the time she uncovered the truth, or what she believed to be the truth, she was no longer reacting. She was planning. The revelation that Taylor had been secretly involved with Ridge, conducting a hidden relationship behind Brooke's back while maintaining her connection with Deacon, was not just a piece of information for Sheila. It was a weapon, and like all weapons in her hands, it was not meant to be used immediately. She understood that timing would determine everything, that exposing the truth too soon would only create chaos without direction, while waiting would allow the tension to build, to reach a point where a single revelation could trigger irreversible consequences. More importantly, she saw an opportunity not just to hurt, but to control, to orchestrate a situation where Deacon would be forced to confront a choice that would define him, not through coercion, but through the weight of his own emotions. Deacon, in Sheila's eyes, was both the key and the weakness, a man driven by a need for connection that made him vulnerable to manipulation even when he believed himself to be strong. His relationship with Taylor had given him a sense of stability, a belief that he had found something genuine in a world that had often denied him that certainty. But beneath that belief lay an insecurity he could not fully escape, a lingering doubt about whether he was truly chosen or merely convenient, whether he was loved or simply tolerated. Sheila saw that doubt clearly, understood how easily it could be amplified, and she built her plan around it, not by confronting him directly, but by placing him in a position where he would have no choice but to confront it himself. Taylor, meanwhile, was navigating her own internal contradictions, trying to balance her connection with Deacon against the unresolved pull she still felt toward Ridge. Her decisions, made in secrecy, were driven not by malice but by confusion, by a desire to hold on to something familiar while exploring something uncertain. She convinced herself that she could manage both worlds without causing harm, that the truth could remain hidden long enough for her to understand her own feelings. But in doing so, she underestimated the fragility of the situation, the way in which even the smallest deception could unravel everything if exposed at the wrong moment. Sheila did not need to create the conflict between Deacon and Taylor. It already existed, waiting to be brought into the light. The brilliance of Sheila's plan lay in its restraint. Instead of confronting Taylor or revealing the truth to Brooke immediately, she chose to approach Deacon, not as an aggressor, but as someone offering clarity, as someone presenting him with evidence that he could not easily dismiss. She constructed the moment carefully, ensuring that the information would reach him in a way that felt undeniable, supported by details that aligned too perfectly with his own subtle suspicions to be ignored. The evidence she presented was not overwhelming in quantity, but it was precise, targeted, designed to strike at the exact points where Deacon's confidence in Taylor was weakest. When Deacon first saw the proof of Taylor's secret meetings with Ridge, his reaction was not explosive but internal, a quiet collapse that began at the edges of his perception and worked its way inward. He did not immediately confront Taylor, did not allow himself the release of anger or accusation, because the pain was not yet fully formed. Instead, it settled into something heavier, something more complex, forcing him to reevaluate every moment he had shared with her, every word that now carried a different meaning in the light of this new understanding. Sheila watched this process unfold with a patience that bordered on cruelty, knowing that the longer he held the truth inside, the more it would distort his emotions, the more it would prepare him for the choice she intended to force upon him. The choice itself was not presented as a demand, but as an inevitability. Sheila did not tell Deacon what to do. She simply made it clear that he could no longer remain in a state of uncertainty, that the truth he now possessed required action, required a decision that would define not just his relationship with Taylor, but his understanding of himself. He could confront her, expose the deception, and risk losing everything, or he could remain silent, allowing the lie to continue while carrying the burden of knowing. In either case, the outcome would not be clean, would not offer a sense of resolution, and that was precisely what Sheila wanted. She was not interested in a simple victory. She wanted transformation, the kind that comes from being forced to confront a reality that cannot be easily accepted. As Deacon struggled with this decision, the tension between him and Taylor began to shift in subtle but unmistakable ways. Conversations became strained, filled with pauses that carried more weight than words, with glances that searched for something unspoken. Taylor sensed the change, but could not identify its source, her own guilt making her hyper-aware of every potential sign of exposure. She tried to maintain normalcy, to preserve the illusion of stability, but the effort only made the cracks more visible, more pronounced. The relationship that had once felt like a refuge began to feel like a performance, each of them playing a role they no longer fully believed in. Brooke, unaware of the deception unfolding around her, continued to trust Taylor, to see her as someone who would never betray that trust in such a fundamental way. This lack of suspicion created a cruel contrast, highlighting the extent to which Taylor's actions had already crossed a line that could not be easily justified. Sheila understood the power of this contrast, the way it would amplify the eventual revelation, turning it from a private betrayal into something far more public, far more damaging. But again, she waited, allowing the tension to build, allowing the emotional stakes to rise until the moment of exposure would carry maximum impact. When the truth finally came to light, it did not arrive as a controlled disclosure, but as a rupture, a sudden and overwhelming collapse of the fragile balance that had been maintained for so long. Deacon's confrontation with Taylor was not fueled by immediate rage, but by a deeper, more painful clarity, the kind that comes from prolonged doubt finally resolving into certainty. His words, when they came, were measured but heavy, each one carrying the weight of everything he had held back, everything he had tried to understand without allowing himself to fully feel. Taylor's response was equally complex, a mixture of regret, defensiveness, and a desperate attempt to explain a situation that had already moved beyond explanation. The fallout was immediate and far-reaching, extending beyond Deacon and Taylor to encompass Brooke and Ridge, drawing them into a conflict that exposed long-buried tensions and unresolved emotions. Brooke's sense of betrayal was not just about the secret relationship, but about the trust that had been violated, the assumption that certain lines would never be crossed. Ridge, caught between past and present, was forced to confront his own role in the situation, to acknowledge the consequences of choices that had been made in secrecy and rationalized in isolation. And through it all, Sheila remained just out of reach. Her presence felt but not yet revealed. Watching as the emotional architecture she had carefully destabilized began to collapse under its own weight. She had not needed to strike directly, had not needed to create conflict where none existed. She had simply understood the existing dynamics, identified the points of vulnerability, and applied pressure with precision and patience. The result was not just chaos, but a transformation of relationships, a reshaping of trust and perception that would continue to unfold long after her role in it was fully understood. In the end, Sheila's greatest weapon was not her ability to destroy, but her ability to make others do it for her, to guide them toward choices that felt like their own while ensuring that those choices led exactly where she intended. And as the consequences of her plan continued to ripple outward, affecting every connection within that fragile network of relationships, one truth became impossible to ignore: the most dangerous threat is not always the one that acts, but the one that waits, that watches, and that understands exactly when to let everything fall apart. Sheila did not step forward when the truth exploded. She stepped back, because the most exquisite part of her design was never the revelation itself, but what came after: the slow unraveling of trust that no one could repair once it had been torn open. As Deacon and Taylor stood in the wreckage of what they had once believed was something stable, something worth building on, they were no longer simply confronting each other, but the distorted reflections of themselves that had emerged under pressure. Every word between them now carried suspicion. Every silence felt like an accusation, and the emotional ground they stood on began to erode beneath their feet, leaving neither of them certain where loyalty ended and self-preservation began. Deacon's pain did not express itself in anger alone, but in something far more destabilizing: a quiet, persistent disillusionment that reshaped the way he saw everything Taylor had ever said to him. What had once felt like comfort now felt rehearsed. What had once seemed like vulnerability now seemed calculated, and even the moments that had appeared most genuine began to feel contaminated by doubt. He was not simply grieving a betrayal. He was grieving the loss of his own belief in something real, something he had convinced himself he deserved after years of chaos. That loss cut deeper than any single act of deception, because it forced him to question not just Taylor's honesty, but his own judgment, his own need to trust, his own willingness to ignore the subtle signs that something was not right. Taylor, in turn, found herself trapped in a reality she could no longer control, where explanations sounded like excuses and intentions lost their meaning in the face of undeniable evidence. She had believed she could manage her emotions, that she could navigate the pull between Deacon and Ridge without causing irreversible harm. But now she was confronted with the truth that her attempt to hold on to both had cost her everything. The weight of Brooke's unwitting trust pressed heavily on her conscience, turning what had once been a private conflict into something that felt morally inescapable. She was no longer simply defending herself against Deacon's accusations. She was confronting the person she had become in the process of trying to avoid hurting anyone. And still, Sheila waited. She watched as the fracture between Deacon and Taylor widened into something that could not be repaired by apologies or explanations, because the damage was no longer about a single betrayal, but about the collapse of an entire emotional structure. She understood that once doubt reached a certain depth, it became self-sustaining, feeding on itself, growing stronger with every attempt to resolve it. There was no need for her to intervene, no need to reveal her role in the chain of events, because the people she had targeted were already doing exactly what she wanted, destroying their own connections, piece by piece, without realizing that the path they were walking had been carefully prepared for them. The ripple effect began to spread outward, reaching Brooke in a way that felt almost cruel in its timing. When she finally learned the truth, it was not just Taylor's betrayal that shook her, but the realization that she had never seen it coming, that she had trusted without question, without hesitation. That blindness became its own form of wound, forcing her to reevaluate not just her relationship with Taylor, but her understanding of the people she believed she knew best. The idea that someone so close to her could carry such a significant secret without revealing even a hint of it created a quiet, but profound shift in her perception, one that would not easily be undone. Ridge, caught in the center of this emotional fallout, found himself unable to escape the consequences of choices he had once justified as temporary, as manageable, as something that could be contained. Now, those choices had taken on a life of their own, shaping the narrative in ways he could no longer control. His connection with Taylor, once complicated but private, was now exposed, reframed through the lens of betrayal and secrecy. At the same time, his history with Brooke resurfaced in a way that made every unresolved tension impossible to ignore, pulling him back into a dynamic he had never fully escaped. The past and the present collided around him, leaving him with no clear direction, only the knowledge that whatever he chose next would carry consequences he could not predict. For the younger generation, the fallout was even more destabilizing because it shattered the illusion that the adults in their lives operated with a sense of clarity and control. What they saw instead was confusion, contradiction, and emotional recklessness, a realization that forced them to question the foundations they had grown up believing in. Relationships that had once seemed aspirational now appeared fragile, vulnerable to the same kind of secrecy and self-deception that had just caused so much damage. Love, which had always been presented as something worth fighting for, now seemed entangled with risk, with the possibility of becoming something destructive if not handled with care. And in the middle of it all, Deacon reached a point where the choice Sheila had orchestrated could no longer be avoided. He could not return to what had been, because the knowledge he carried made that impossible. He could not fully move forward, because the emotional debris of the past still clung to him, shaping his reactions, influencing his decisions. The confrontation with Taylor had not provided closure. It had only deepened the complexity of his feelings, leaving him suspended between anger and loss, between rejection and a lingering, unwanted attachment. The more he tried to define what he felt, the more it slipped through his grasp, refusing to settle into something simple or manageable. It was in that state of uncertainty that Sheila finally began to move again. Not by revealing herself, not by stepping into the open, but by shifting the balance just enough to ensure that the instability she had created would not resolve itself. A message delivered at the right moment, a piece of information placed where it would be found, a suggestion planted in a conversation that seemed otherwise insignificant. These were the tools she used, subtle and precise, designed to keep the emotional tension alive, to prevent healing from taking hold. She understood that people, when left alone, eventually seek resolution, but when guided carefully, they could be kept in a state of conflict far longer than they realize. The brilliance of her manipulation was that no one could trace it back to her, at least not yet. From the outside, everything appeared to be the result of personal choices, of human weakness, of emotional complexity. The betrayals were real, the reactions were genuine, the pain was undeniable. Sheila had not created those elements. She had only arranged them, positioning them in a way that ensured maximum impact. And because of that, her influence remained invisible, woven into the fabric of events in a way that could not be easily separated from the actions of those involved. As the days passed, and the immediate shock began to settle into something more enduring, the characters found themselves facing a reality that was not defined by a single moment, but by the accumulation of many, each one shaped by decisions that could not be undone. Trust had been broken, not just between individuals, but within the broader network of relationships that connected them all. The question was no longer whether things could return to how they had been, but whether something new could be built from what remained, something that acknowledged the damage without being defined entirely by it. And somewhere beyond their awareness, Sheila watched, patient as ever, knowing that this was not the end of her plan, but only its most visible phase. The true outcome was still unfolding, still taking shape in the choices that had yet to be made, in the emotions that had yet to be fully understood. Because for Sheila, the goal was never just to expose the truth or to create chaos. It was to reshape the emotional landscape itself, to alter the way people saw each other, trusted each other, and ultimately, how they chose to love. And as long as those choices remained uncertain, as long as doubt lingered where certainty once existed, she would remain exactly where she had always been, not gone, not forgotten, but waiting for the next moment when everything could be pushed just a little further. Just enough to ensure that the damage